Hi, my name is Aaron Lacey, and you are listening to Projecting Outcomes under the U.S. Department of Education's Financial Value Transparency and Gainful Employment Rule. Quite a mouthful. This webinar is being offered as part of the Higher Education webinar series. It's brought to you by Thompson Coburn LLP, and it's being broadcast for the first time on November 14th, 2023. While other folks are coming online, I thought I would take a minute just to go through some housekeeping. So first of all, if you look around the sort of perimeter of your screen, you'll see a Q&A widget for questions that you can type in during the presentation. If you're listening on November 14th during the initial broadcast, there will be a live Q&A session at the end of the primary webinar. So please put those Q&As in there, or put the Q's in, and we'll try to get to the A's at the end. There's also a resource widget, and we do have several things in there for you today of particular note. First of all, we've got our updated desk guide that covers a lot of the same material that we're going to go through today, but the desk guide actually just sets it out all in sort of a narrative format. We also have there for you the slides from this presentation. And there's a lot of content, a lot of links in the presentation, so you'll want to pull down that PDF, and that way you can access it later. And also, just to be very clear, this webinar will be, it's recorded and it will be posted to our firm's YouTube site, so you can watch it later if you'd like as well. We have a help widget where you can find some answers to some common technical questions. If you are an attorney tuning in for continuing legal education today, this webinar has been approved for continuing legal education in several jurisdictions. You can go back to that resource widget and find a page that details the jurisdictions for which the webinar has been approved and the amount of time that's been approved in each. And I'll also remind you that throughout the webinar today, we're going to have secret words. I think there are 3. And when those pop up on your screen, you'll see another window off to the right that will have the secret word along with 2 or 3 others. So as to trick you if you're not paying good attention with a radio button, and you just want to click the radio button that corresponds with the secret word. And that way you get your CLE credit. Please remember, we are able to award CLE credit based on your attendance throughout the entire webinar and the clicking on those appropriate secret words. And finally, there is a post-webinar survey. As always, we are very grateful for any input that you can provide us. We really do review those, take them very seriously, and try to make each webinar better than the one before. If you're here with us for the first time, Thompson Coburn is a law firm. We're fairly large. We're headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri, but we have offices around the United States. Much of our higher education practice actually sits in our Washington, D.C. office, though I am personally here in the middle of the country in St. Louis. Speaking of our higher ed practice, we have a group of attorneys within this law firm that spend all or most of their time serving institutions of higher education. Many of us have either spent time in-house in institutions or have backgrounds. We have a couple of folks who have advanced degrees in education, things along those lines, but have committed to really serving this industry and understanding what is unique about it, and in particular the regulatory environment that is particular for higher education. I'll also point out, in addition to providing legal services, our higher education practice works pretty hard to create a fairly significant and broad set of complementary guides and webinars and blog posts and things of that nature to try to assist the community. And if you go to this QR code right here, you can scan it with your phone. We got wise and put all of our different resources in one place, and that's our higher education resources page, and we'd love for you to find that. You can also get to it easily if you just want to type in Thompson Coburn /higher ed into your browser. But please check those materials out. And of course, if you go to that spot in a couple of days, you will also find there this webinar, the prior webinar we did last week, and a lot of other resources, the desk guide, etc., dealing with gainful employment and bar defense and all the other things that the U.S. Department of Education and others have been sending our way as a community in the last 18 months or so. I'll be the presenter today. My name is Aaron Lacey, as I mentioned at the outset, and I'm the chair of the higher education practice. And this happens to be a particular focus for me. So like the practice itself, I do a lot of things for institutions of higher ed, but one of my sort of core areas of expertise is federal higher education law and policy. And in particular, I've spent now, incredibly, to me at least, 13 years tracking this particular rule and its various iterations. So thought I would spend the time today with you walking you through how to project some of these, your program's performance under some of the metrics that are included in the new Financial Value Transparency and Gainful Employment Rule. So here's our syllabus. We're going to start just talking a few minutes about the Financial Value Transparency and Gainful Employment Rule and sort of how we got here today. I appreciate that many of you may have tuned in to our prior webinar, so I'm going to try to get through this introductory section quite expeditiously, but want to make sure, just in case there are those who are joining us for the first time, that we level set and everybody is on the same page about what we're doing here. I'm going to briefly, similarly, go through metrics and consequences, but then the majority of this presentation is really going to focus on these last two sections, projecting DE rates and projecting the earnings premium. And these are the two key metrics that the department's going to be using for making judgments about the value of your programs under this new rule. And so we want to make sure that you understand how these calculations work. And the real concept here with this presentation is we're trying to give you a multi-step process that you can use to potentially project the performance of your programs in the years to come, and if need be, to start to use that information to inform a strategy for compliance over the long term. So let's start again with just getting our minds around what we're talking about when we say the Financial Value Transparency and Gainful Employment Rule, which is, by the way, one rule. I mentioned in the last webinar, and I'll say here again, I've had some folks come up to me and say, well, you've talked about gainful employment. Tell me about financial value transparency, or vice versa. And just to be clear, this is one regulation, right? So the Higher Education Act of 1965, the HEA, as many of you know, since its inception has required all non-degree programs offered by public and private nonprofit institutions and all programs offered by for-profit institutions. In the statutory text, it says any programs fitting into those buckets, quote, have to prepare students for gainful employment and a recognized occupation. And you can see we just have a little chart down here below that hopefully makes this a little bit easier to track. So you see the type of institution. If it's public and private nonprofit, then your GE programs are non-degree programs, and your non-GE programs are all your degree programs, right? So let me say that again. If you're a public or private nonprofit institution, all those diplomas and certificates, anything that's a non-degree program, that's a GE program. Anything that's a degree program, that's a non-GE program. And I know this may seem a little much to get the brain around, but it's important that you keep these organized, because throughout the rest of this presentation, that's what we're going to be talking about, is GE programs and non-GE programs, right? If you're a proprietary institution, it's a little bit easier because everything's a GE program. That's how it works in the statutory framework and how it always has worked. Okay, so in 2010, the Obama administration said, well, we've got this phrase in the HEA talking about, that these types of GE programs have to satisfy this gainful employment standard, and we want to figure out a way to measure that, to determine whether schools and their programs specifically are actually meeting that standard. So they created what was a complex rule that, among other things, attempted to compare the typical debt a program's graduates took on with their typical earnings 2-3 years after graduation. So this is sort of this debt to earnings concept that we'll be referring to throughout this presentation. And they used that concept, and they created this idea of a DE rate, or debt to earnings rate, right? So they were going to calculate this number for each program. And if institutions didn't fare well, or specifically if their programs didn't fare well, I should be specific, this is not an institution level analysis. DE rates are calculated on a program by program basis, right? So just to be very clear, it's an important point. So the Obama administration rolled this out. And we'll see, that was in 2010. Folks went to court, they were sued, and the court actually said, look, there are parts of this that don't make sense to us. And in particular, there was a repayment rate concept in that 2010 version of the rule that the court didn't like. And so the rule, the 2010 GE rule, was largely taken off the books. Are invalidated. The Obama administration came back in 2014 and came up with a new version that did not include the repayment rate, but only focused on the DE rate concept, the earnings rate concept, right? Again, they were sued. And again, the court took issue with how the department in this case was managing earnings, because in the 2014 rule, for the first time, the department wanted to use actual earnings from graduates, right? As opposed to using BLS data or something like that. Once again, the court took issue with the rule, and things were still moving along, and it looked like the administration was going to have trouble, but then the Trump administration came in and rescinded the rule, so the litigation became moot, right? So time has passed. The Biden administration came in and said, look, we continue to believe that this gainful employment rule is important, and that this debt to earnings rate concept, among others, is important, and that programs should be accountable for something along these lines. And so we're going to put a new rule into place. And on October 10th, 2023, just a little over a month ago, the department published its final financial value transparency and gainful employment rule. So that's this administration, and it was just about a week ago. If you click on that link, by the way, in the PDF or on the picture of the Federal Register, it will take you to the new final rule text. This rule will become effective July 1, 2024, unless it gets held up through litigation or some other means, which, by the way, is quite possible. The important point right out of the gates, and why I think there are probably more traditional institutions of higher ed, meaning publics and private nonprofits, on the line than would have been the case in 2014, is because this rule has been expanded by the Biden administration to cover every Title IV program at every Title IV institution. So what that means is there are elements of this regulatory framework that cover both GE and non-GE programs. And this is the first time any version of this rule has extended to non-GE programs. Specifically, the debt to earnings rate and the earnings premium, which is a new concept that's been introduced with this rule, is going to be calculated for every Title IV program at every Title IV institution. Right. So whereas in 2010 and 2014, only GE programs and schools offering GE programs would have been concerned with how these rates are calculated and how their programs might perform. Now, under this rule, every institution is going to see every one of its Title IV programs subjected to these rates, and the department's going to calculate these debt-to-earnings rates and earnings premium, and it's going to put it on an external website that it's going to create. And among other things, if there are programs that fail under its determined thresholds that are also in the new rule, then the department's going to label those programs as low-earning or high debt burden. So you can see immediately the stakes are significant for all institutions. Now you've got a federal agency making a value determination with regard to your program and then publicizing that value determination on a federal website that you as an institution are going to have to disclose and potentially direct students to. It still will be the case that only GE programs could lose their Title IV eligibility if they fail over so many years to satisfy these rates. But failing graduate level non-GE programs, so if you are a public institution or private nonprofit institution and you have a graduate degree program, like a law program, right, or a PhD program, and it has a failing DE rate, there also are consequences. You'll have to make sure that students, before you can enroll them potentially, have to go to the department's website and see these value determinations. The new rule also includes significant reporting and disclosure requirements for all schools. So the point of this slide is just to say this is an important rule, and it's going to impact all institutions. Even if you have great programs that have no problems, you've got all the reporting and disclosure obligations and things you've got to integrate. So there's going to be a lot that has to be done. If you are not familiar with the overall concept here, the regulatory framework, the reporting requirements, the disclosure requirements, etc., last week, about 7 days ago on November 7th, we broadcast an almost 3-hour webinar that covered every aspect of this rule, right? And it is recorded, it is on our YouTube channel, and it's free. So if you're looking for assistance in wrapping your brain around this entire new rule, please feel free to go watch that webinar. We'd be delighted for you to do so. I also mentioned at the outset, we are putting out a desk guide. It is in the resources widget today. You can see a picture of it right here on the screen. And it takes a lot of the concepts. There's a brief summary of the overall rule, right? But then the core part of that desk guide, just like this presentation, is really in breaking down these calculations and helping you understand potentially how you can project performance for your program. So again, these are free resources, and we would love for you to check them out, collect all 3, pass them around to your friends. The whole point is we want to help the community because this is a big, complicated thing, and you got about 9 months to develop strategies. And I also want to highlight, and I said it in the webinar last week, getting your brain around, how your programs are likely going to perform as soon as possible is important, because the way this rule is backward looking and the data it takes into account is prior year data, it's really important that you start implementing change as soon as possible or rolling out new programs quickly. And if you watch last week's webinar or you make your way through this one today, I think you'll start to understand what I mean by that and why it's important to really get ahead of this thing as soon as possible. Okay, so going on to our next slide here, metrics and consequences. We want to talk just a little bit about what the core ideas are that are going to be covered in the new rule and these really consequential metrics and thresholds, and then we'll get into the calculations themselves. So First of all, with limited exception, let's start with the DE rate, right? The debt to earnings rate. With limited exception, each year the department's going to calculate 2 debt to earnings rates for every single Title IV program at every single Title IV institution. So I know I called it DE rates, but they're actually 2 calculations we're talking about, and the math is right here. So the annual debt to earnings rate is an annual loan payment over median annual earnings. So they're going to take a group of students, and we're going to get into all of this today in the presentation. That's the point. But they're just sort of to generally talk about it right now, they're going to take this group of students that you actually went through your program. They're going to get you to report a whole bunch of data to them about costs and debt for those students, and they're going to look and calculate for that cohort the annual loan payment that cohort likely is paying as a result of that cost and debt information, right? And then they're going to figure out from an as yet to be named earnings entity, they're going to pull data and they're going to come up with a median annual earnings number, presumably for that same group of people. And they're going to calculate this debt to earnings rate, right? And that's the annual DE rate. And then they're going to have this second rate, which is slight variation on the annual DE rate, and that's the discretionary DE rate. So annual loan payment over median annual earnings, that's the annual DE rate. Annual loan payment over discretionary earnings, that's the discretionary DE rate. And again, the department's going to calculate each of these numbers for each Title IV program that you offer, whether it's a degree program, a non-degree program, GE or non-GE. If you're a Title IV institution and these are Title IV eligible programs, these 2 numbers are going to be calculated. Okay, so what's failing? What's the threshold? So when the department calculates this DE rate, first of all, and this is just the fail, so if you're better than this, you're passing, right? It's just pass or fail. There's no in between like there used to be under some prior versions of the rule. The annual DE rate that they calculate for your program needs to be greater than 8%, and the discretionary DE rate greater than 20%. Now, I want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, both of these rates have to be failing for you to fail in any given year, right? So let me just say that again. Both of these rates have to be failing for your program to fail. So if you have a passing annual DE rate and a failing discretionary DE rate, you're okay. You passed because you passed on the annual DE rate. Or vice versa. Even if you fail the annual DE rate, if you have a passing discretionary DE rate, then you would pass for the year. So again, just to be clear, both of these rates that are calculated for your program have to be failing in a given year for you to fail for that year. Right? Now, I said the annual DE rate greater than 8%, discretionary DE rate is greater than 20%. You'll see there's some other language in the parens. I'll go through it quickly, but it's a little unusual that these would occur. But the notion is for the annual DE rate, it's greater than 8%, or if you've got a positive numerator, meaning there was some level of debt or cost, and your denominator is 0, meaning no one has any earnings reported, right, then you would also fail. And that occasionally can happen. The point they're trying to make is, if your denominator is 0, you're actually less than 8%. But if your graduates have no earnings, you would still fail. That's the idea, right? Similarly with the discretionary DE rate, if the numerator is positive, so there's some level of debt or cost, and the denominator is negative or 0, and because of the way this calculation works, you could actually have negative earnings theoretically in the denominator. Once again, they're saying, well, that would also fail, right? So if you've got a 0 or a negative number, you don't get a pass. So you want to be, generally speaking, between 0 and 8% or 0 and 20%. If you're over 8, over 20, or 0 or less in either column, you would fail. Okay. The earnings premium. This is a new concept the department has debuted in this version of the rule we've never seen before. And it's simpler in concept. So the department is also going to calculate what they call this earnings premium. And they're going to start with that median annual earnings, which, by the way, is the same median annual earnings that's used in the debt to earnings rates, right? So they'll calculate it for purposes of both of these metrics. And then they're going to subtract from that this thing that they call the earnings threshold, which the way I sort of describe it is they're trying to come up with what they think is sort of average earnings for folks who have no post-secondary education at all. And conceptually, philosophically, the idea here is if folks with no post-secondary education are making more than the median earnings of your graduates, then your program is failing, right? So if you subtract that earnings threshold from your median annual earnings for your program and it's 0 or less than 0, then we have a problem. Then you would be failing. I just want to highlight, though, and if you go back and watch the webinar we did last week, that's the big sort of comprehensive discussion, we think there are some real concerns with this calculation, in particular this earnings threshold number, and expect that it will be the subject. There will be lengthy discussion about it in any forthcoming litigation. Similar, just like with the DE rates, there's a threshold here, right? And I just mentioned this, but just to go over it again, the department every year is going to calculate this earnings premium. And the basically the idea is if the earnings premium is zero or negative, in other words, if those folks with no post-secondary education are making the same or more than your graduates, then you would fail this metric as well. Okay, consequences. Again, we covered this at length in last week's webinar. I'm just going to talk about this very briefly. But for undergraduate degree programs, there is no real consequence. So if you've got a non-GE program, right, and that would be an undergraduate degree program, in this case, offered by a public or private nonprofit institution. Now, they're still going to calculate your rates, and it's still going to be disclosed on the federal website, which is a consequence in a sense, don't get me wrong. But there's no additional consequence, right? Like loss of Title IV eligibility or something like that. Okay, I mentioned earlier, for graduate degree programs, so again, at public and private nonprofit institutions, if you've got degree programs that are graduate level programs, master's, PhD, professional programs like a JD or an MBA, right? And the program has failing DE rates, 2 out of 3, or actually any year for which it has a failing DE rate, then the subsequent year, as soon as you're notified by the department, then you're going to have to, your students will have to actually go and through the department's federal website, acknowledge that they have seen the failing and the department's value determinations before they can sign any sort of enrollment agreement and presumably enroll and begin with you. So that's a pretty significant consequence. And if you look at some of the impact projections that the department came up with and that we discussed in last week's webinar, you know, particularly among law programs, there are a number of them that that the department thinks will be failing under these rates. Finally, if you have GE programs, so for publics and private nonprofits, this is all your certificates, all your degree programs, including graduate level certificates. Remember, so it's not about whether it's graduate or undergraduate. In this case, it's just about whether it's degree or non-degree. So if you're a public or private nonprofit institution, all your non-degree Title IV eligible programming are GE programs. By the way, if you have a certificate or diploma, it's not Title IV eligible at all. It's just not part of any of this, right? Because it's not really overseen by the U.S. Department of Education. So we're talking about non-degree programs at public and private nonprofit institutions that are Title IV eligible programs. And then for proprietary institutions, it's everything, whether it's degree, non-degree. If it's a Title IV program, it's a GE program. So the consequences for GE programs, as has always been the case under this rule and this concept going all the way back to 2010, are significant. First of all, if you fail a single year, you've got to start making these student warnings. Secondly, your program, if you fail 2 out of 3 consecutive years, either metric, you could lose Title IV eligibility for the program. And thirdly, you can't actually roll out a substantially similar program for a 3-year period after you have a GE program that fails. So these are significant consequences. Again, we go into them in more detail in last week's general overview. I just wanted to give you sort of the baseline there, make sure we all knew what we were talking about. And now I want to jump into the 9-step process, right, for actually projecting these DE rates. Because again, the way this all works, the department's using data that it's going to gather from prior to the effective date of the rule, prior to July 1, 2024, going back multiple award years. And it's all that prior backward-looking data that actually informs your rates. So you need to start acting now and figuring out your strategy. If you wait until July 1, 2024, you're losing a lot of really precious time, particularly if you've got programs that are problematic and need to be replaced by new programs, or where you're thinking you want to make adjustments to the cost, and if you can, the borrowing behavior for that program. Right? It's hard to impact the earnings, only so much you can do. But you can impact the numerator when it comes to debt to earnings rates, and that's something you want to know early on so you can start implementing your strategy. Okay, I'll take a deep breath, right? As many of you know, if you watch these webinars, sometimes I get rolling pretty quickly, so I have to slow myself down. So this is a 9-step process. We got 2 metrics, debt to earnings and earnings premium. We're going to start with the debt to earnings rate. And we're starting here with the first step, which is confirming institutional scope. Aaron, what do you mean by that? Oh, by the way, also right here, you can see we've got both of the equations. And I just wanted to highlight for you that right now we're really focused, this part of the process is focused on calculating the numerators for the 2 DE rates, which is the same, right? That number is the same in both of these equations. Okay, so the first step, confirming institutional scope. If you're actually the person at your institution. And that's what this is webinar and the desk guide are designed for, is those folks who's trying to model these numbers. The first thing you have to understand is what is your institution as it's conceived by the U.S. Department of Education. So when institutions of higher education, as some of you know, particularly if you're in financial aid, when an institution first gets certified and becomes eligible to participate in Title IV, the department assigns the institution Office of Post-Secondary Education Identification Number, or OPE ID. All of these calculations, everything related to non-GE, GE programs, sort of the notion of what is a program, to figuring that out, which will be our next, all that stuff starts with the OPE ID, right? So under the new rule, again, when the department calculates DE rates for both non-GE and GE programs, and also the earnings premium for that matter, everything will be done within the OPE ID, right? So the first step is you got to know what is the OPID we're dealing with, and what are the what's the main campus and all the additional locations as viewed by the U.S. Department of Education that are part of that OPID. And this sometimes can be tricky, because sometimes you'll have university systems, for example. There are public systems that are designed this way, where you might have a single board, but each of the institutions in the public system has its own OPID number. On the other hand, you may have one OPID that includes 2 or 3 additional locations, and to the public, those almost look like different schools. But to the U.S. Department of Education, it's one big OPEID, right? So you sort of have to set aside what may be the public view of whether things are separate institutions or combined, et cetera, and you really have to focus on the OPID itself. What does the department consider to be all the parts of this institution? Because when they're calculating these rates, they're going to pull everything up into the OPID, because they consider that to be one school. So this is a really critical first step. If you don't get this first step right, it's going to throw off all your calculations. And we work all the time with clients, private, nonprofit, proprietary, and public, where they have a system that has multiple OPEIDs, right? And so you got to make sure that you've got those buckets right, those foundational buckets right, before you proceed, because that's what the department's going to do. All their systems, as those of you in financial aid and compliance and some others will know, all of their systems are built around this notion of OPEID, right? So it's really important to keep that concept. Okay, so after let's say you know for certain, you say, well, Aaron, we're a small school, we only have one campus. Or you say, well, we're big, but we know we have 2 OPIDs, and this is the main campus, and these 3 locations that go over here, and this is the main campus, and these 2 locations that go over here. So I've got my OPEIDs. By the way, another really easy way to figure that out is ask your financial aid office to provide you with the ECAR, Eligibility Certification and Approval Report, for your institution, because it's designed by OPID. You get each OPID has an ECAR, and there's a place several pages down in the ECAR where it lists all the additional locations. So if you're not 100% sure, talk with your financial aid office. They should be able to tell you whether you have 1 OPID or 2 that you're dealing with, and how the locations are grouped. Everyone has one main campus, and however many additional locations are attached to it. But that's a real good place to go if you're not sure. Okay, so after you know the OPID, step 2, right, is to identify your programs. And you might say, well, Aaron, how hard is this? I'll just go down, I'll look at the catalog, or I'll just go down to talk to my academic dean, and they'll tell me, here's the list of programs. That's not a bad idea, but it may not work, because what we're focused on is what the U.S. Department of Education thinks of as a program, and most importantly, we'll think of as a program when it gets to the point of getting ready to calculate these rates. And it could very well be quite different from what you as an institution think about when you think about the programs that we offer. So the department, this is how they, and I will say, for once, there's something that's easy here. The fundamental concept for how you define a program is the same for non-GE programs and GE programs. So thank goodness we don't have 2 different concepts. We just have one. This is how the department identifies a program within an OPID, right? It's a Title IV eligible program, which is identified by a combination of 6-digit classification of instructional programs, or SIP code, and credential level. And that's it, right? So when the department is trying to decide how many programs you offer, what it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, we want to look within your OPID, and then we want to see for each academic program that you offer, what's the SIP code and what's the credential level at which it is offered. And those are the only 2 data points within a single OPID. Those are the only 2 data points the department uses to determine programs or sort one program from another. And candidly, this is, you know, if you're thinking about, well, why would they do it that way? It's a data issue, right? The department, I mean, folks have all kinds of different names for their programs. They couldn't just use titles of programs to figure this out. They had to sort of think about, well, what do we have in our system that will allow us to distinguish one academic program from another? And it's zip code and credential level. Those are the two sort of reliable data points that they have. So in order to identify your programs, we suggest that the first thing you do within an OPID level, right, is divide all of your academic programs by credential level. So let's get all of the, you know, associate degrees together. Well, here, I can do you one better. Let's look at this slide. So these are the different credential levels that are recognized by the U.S. Department of Education in the regulation. Also, this is a good opportunity to remind folks, at the bottom of the screen there, underneath the slides, we've included citations to the regulatory text. Now, keep in mind, this doesn't exist yet if you pull up the electronic CFR, because this rule doesn't become effective until July 1 of next year. But if you go to the Federal Register, you will see it. That's why we've included in parens July 1st, 2024. But if you go to the Federal Register, look at the new regulatory text at the very end of the published document, you'll find all of this regulatory language that will become effective next July 1. So in the new rule, once it becomes effective, the department identifies these as the different credential levels: undergraduate certificate or diploma, associate degree, bachelor's degree, post-baccalaureate certificate. So we're still talking about an undergraduate level certificate program, but it's post-baccalaureate, doctoral degree, first professional degree, like a JD, graduate certificates, including a postgraduate certificate. So again, our suggestion is the first thing you ought to do is within your OPID, once you've decided what's the institution that we're dealing with here, get all your programs and divide them up by credential level. Next, within each credential level, so you'll say, okay, these are all our associate degree programs, right? Divide the programs by zip code, right? So for GE programs, they're listed on your eCar. You can actually go, again, that eligibility certification and approval report, and it shows the 6-digit zip code next to each different, even if you're a private nonprofit or a public institution, your eCar is supposed to list all your non-degree programs, right, that are Title IV eligible. So you should be able to find them all there. You may have to look elsewhere, talk to academics and SLDS reporting to come up with the zip codes for your non-GE programs, because they may not be on your eCar. And of course, proprietary schools know that all your programs are listed on your eCar. But somewhere you have to figure out what those zip codes are that have been assigned to each program. So you put them into those credential level groups, and then you divide them up by zip code. But here's the really important point. If you have two programs that are at the same credential level, let's say you have two associate degree programs, and they have the same 6-digit zip code, and you say, well, wait a minute, those are two different programs that we offer. First of all, they have totally different names, and one is offered at our main campus in Omaha, and the other is offered at our branch campus in Miami, Florida. Those are different programs. Here's the important point, and this is why I'm taking time to go through all of this. When the department calculates your DE rates and your earnings premium, that's one program for the department's perspective, right? Let me just say that again, because this is such an important point. When the department runs these numbers within your institution, without regard, again, you could have a program that's offered at 7 different campuses, and you may have 1,000 students in that program at one campus and 3 at another. Doesn't matter. What the department's going to do when all this is processed through its systems, it's going to say within the OPID, we see 4 associate degree programs, right? 2 of them have totally different zip codes, and the other 2 have the same zip code. Those 2 programs are going to be combined. From the department's perspective, that is a single program. And if you're a private nonprofit or public institution, it's a non-GE program. And if you're a proprietary institution, it's a GE program. But from the department's perspective, the critical idea here that I want to impart to you is that those 2 programs are going to be combined because they are at the same credential level and have the exact same zip code, right? You may have to combine programs when you're going through this process. And, if you're trying to project rates and you don't combine 2 programs that are really one program from the department's perspective, it may throw off your projections significantly. So these first 2 concepts, while they may seem rudimentary, are really important. You got to get the OPID straight, and you got to make sure you know how many GE and non-GE programs that you have. And that may not mirror exactly what you think of as your academic program portfolio. All right, that brings us to our first secret word of the day. And the first secret word, it's a contraction. We're cheating. It's really 2 words. Don't tell the folks at the CLE police. The first secret word is it's. It's, as in, it's a great day, or it's going to be a long webinar, or it's not really true that this thing becomes effective July 1st, 2024. Is it, Aaron? Unfortunately, it is. So find that box that's popping up either to my left or to my right on your screen. There should be a number of words listed with a radio button next to each word, and you want to click the radio button that is next to the word it's, because again, it's is the first secret word of the day. All right, moving right along. Step 3, identify your students. And again, this is a little tricky. It's just like when we had to figure out, well, what's the institution from the department's perspective? And then, what are our programs, GE and non-GE programs, and how do we make sure that we're getting the right buckets together there? I like buckets. I'm a big bucket guy, right? So now we have to figure out, well, who are the students that we're talking about within each of these programs for whom we're going to be pulling debt and cost information and earnings information. Okay, so there are 2 or 3 things that go into this. The first thing is the department is going to define, say they propose, when this rule becomes effective, this will be the case. They define student as any individual who received Title IV HEA program funds for enrolling in a non-GE or GE program. So again, there's no distinction here between GE and non-GE. So the first important thing is we're talking about folks who received Title IV HEA program funds. Now that could be a grant, doesn't have to be a loan. But the students for whom we are interested and concerned when we're projecting these rates are students who received Title IV. I also want to note the department is asking you to report data when you go through the reporting requirements in this rule for students who didn't receive Title IV. And that's because they have other things that they're trying to accomplish beyond just calculating these rates. And that's why if you listen to last week's webinar and we go through reporting obligations, there are reporting obligations that relate to folks who didn't complete the program, who didn't receive Title IV. But when we're talking about projecting DE rates and the earnings premium, first of all, the students we're concerned with are strictly students who actually receive some form of Title IV funding for enrolling in the program. This includes, again, individuals who just got grants. It excludes students, obviously, who did not receive any form of Title IV aid, grants, or loans for enrolling in their program. You also have to exclude students who fell into any one of these categories. And as I go through them, I think this will make sense to you. First of all, if the student's Title IV loans have been approved or are being considered for a discharge based on total and permanent disability. Now, some of you may be saying, Aaron, how would we know that? And you might not. We're mirroring here what the department's going to do when they project these rates. And so in some case, and so we want to make sure you have all of this. So if you happen to know this is true, you can pull that student out of your cohort. But I also understand in some cases you may not know some of these things. The department is going to try to find this stuff out using its various systems, right? So it would know this. And when it's actually projecting rates, it'll run, cross checks against its systems, and presumably it will take this student out of the cohort. For purposes of this exercise, we usually say I would not get overly exercised about trying to find out whether every single student in the cohort might fall into one of these categories. But if you know that a student falls into one of these categories, you ought to pull them out. Or if you can find it out with not too much effort, because the department will pull them out when they get ready to run the numbers. So the first is the student is been approved for a permanent disability, right? If the student was enrolled full-time in another eligible program at your institution, or at another institution during the calendar year for which the department obtained earnings information. So this is like the further education exclusion that you see sometimes when you calculate graduation or placement rates or that kind of data. The notion is, if a student left your program, maybe they got that undergraduate degree and now they've gone off to law school. I use law school as the example because I'm a lawyer, right? So they go off to law school. Well, they're not earning any money. They're enrolled in further education, and the department is acknowledging that. So what they're saying is, if during the year for which we would be pulling earnings information when we're calculating our debt to earnings number for your program, this particular individual who graduated for your program shows up as enrolled in another institution during that year, then we know they're not out there earning money, and it's not appropriate to include them in the cohort when we run the numbers, right? So there is a further education exception essentially, and this is where it's found in the regulation, is in these exclusions that permit you to pull folks out of the cohort. Again, I wouldn't kill yourself if you're running projections, but let's say you've got a pre-law program and you can pretty easily verify how many students go right out of your pre-law program into your law school or some other law schools. Well, then it might make sense to go ahead and run the numbers and pull those out of the cohort, right? For undergraduate programs, if the student completed a higher credentialed undergraduate program at the institution after completing the program as of the end of the most recently completed award year prior to the calculation of the DE rates. Whew, Aaron, what is this all about? Okay. So part of what's going on here is when the U.S. Department of Education runs GE numbers, non-GE numbers, when they're running debt to earnings numbers for all of these programs, right? They had to make a decision. What if we have a situation where somebody, say, completed an associate degree, right, at your institution, and you have a stat credential, and the whole thing's designed so that people complete the associate degree program can go into your bachelor's degree program easily. And you did that on purpose because you want them to have that opportunity. So from the department's perspective, you've got this question out, well, when we run the numbers, do we include them as a graduate in the associate degree program? And do we attribute the debt and cost information for the associate degree program just to that program's debt to earnings number? Or do we take them out of the associate degree cohort, put them into the bachelor degree cohort, and then on a future basis, everything will just be calculated for purposes of the bachelor's degree? And they decided to go with the latter, right? So when you're running these numbers, this is important. I wouldn't kill yourself if it's very unusual that you have students who do that. Maybe you don't want to take the time. But let's say you've got a program that has a stat credential like that, and a very significant percentage of your students, after they graduate from your certificate program, go to an associate degree, or after they graduate from your associate degree program, go into your bachelor's degree, then you probably do want to take this into account, because what the department's going to do is they're going to take all of those students who graduated from your associate degree and matriculated into the bachelor's degree program. They're going to take them out of the associate degree cohort and they're going to put them into the bachelor's degree cohort. And all of the debt and cost associated with the associate degree will also be brought over and included in the bachelor's degree calculation. So they'll become a part of the bachelor's degree cohort, and all of their debt and cost and earnings information will be part of the debt to earnings calculation for the bachelor's degree cohort, and they essentially disappear from the associate degree cohort, right? So that's how the department is going to handle that situation. When you're projecting your numbers, again, I wouldn't worry about it too much unless you've got a program where that happens a lot and could actually impact your numbers, in which case you want to go ahead and make that adjustment. So the next bullet on this slide is the same thing. You'll just see it says for graduate programs, the student completed a higher credentialed graduate program at the institution after completing the program as of the end of the most recently completed award year, prior to the calculation of the DE rates. But here again, the important concept here is when the department does this, it doesn't cross from undergraduate to graduate, right? So it takes all of the debt and cost at the undergraduate level at your institution and rolls it up to the highest credentialed undergraduate degree completed at your program. So again, that's that example of the associate degree to the bachelor's. And then over on the other side of the line, let's say someone finished their master's program and matriculated into your PhD program, common concept, right? They're going to say, okay, we're going to take them out of the master's cohort and everything's going to be attributed to the PhD, right? But it doesn't cross the line. So if you had someone complete a bachelor's degree and then go to your law school for a law degree, you don't take all the debt from the bachelor's degree and attribute it to the JD program, right? So it never crosses from undergraduate to graduate, and that's why you have two different bullets here in this list. Finally, the student is enrolled in an approved prison education program or a comprehensive transition and post-secondary program. So the department is recognizing if your student is in prison, they may not be earning what they otherwise would expect to earn. And lastly, you are not penalized for students who are deceased, and again, probably not reaching their full earnings potential. I don't mean to make a joke. Okay, so once you've gone through and you figured out your OPID, your institution, and then you figured out the programs at the institution, right, within the OPID, you've sort of sorted out what are your GE and non-GE programs, and then finally you figured out who are the students we're talking about that are going to be in the cohorts for each of these programs. Now you have to really finalize that cohort, and this is probably one of the trickiest bits throughout the presentation. So we'll go through this quite methodically because I want to make sure everybody is getting it. Okay, so first of all, the DE rates for each program are based on data for students who completed the program during the applicable cohort. So we're not concerned with folks who withdrew, at least when we're doing these calculations. Obviously, withdrawals are concerned from an institutional and academic standpoint and for other reasons. But for purposes of projecting debt to earnings rates or the earnings premium, when we're developing and finalizing your cohort, we're only talking about those eligible Title IV students, right, in the GE or non-GE program. We exclude the folks who may have fallen into one of those categories we just went through. And then beyond that, we're also just talking about your completers. By the way, another point I want to make is, we had to eventually decide on an order for all of this just for purposes of our presentation, but you could obviously approach this in different ways. You might first just pull your completers, right? And then you might pull the completers who actually got Title IV, and once you got that, then you might go through those other exclusions as the last step. So this doesn't have to be done in a particular order when you're finalizing your cohort, right? Whatever for you from your system standpoint makes the most sense. The critical idea is just that you know when you're finalizing this cohort, what are the various things that have to be true for students to be included in the final cohort, right? And you pull out all the folks who don't meet one of the required criterion. Okay, so to finalize your student cohort for each non-GE and GE program, here's the other question, is time period, right? So we talked through students, completers, title, they received some type, I should say, not that they're Title IV eligible, that they received some type of Title IV, they weren't excluded because of one of the other categories of exclusions. But now, what's the date range we're talking about, right? Well, it varies. So the starting point is always a 2-year cohort. And we're talking about, when I say year, I mean award years. So you're going to start by saying we're looking at, I'll say, qualifying completers, right? Who completed the program during the 2-year cohort period. And I'll show you a graphic in a minute that shows you what exactly the 2 award years I'm talking about. And that's where the department will start and end if you've got over 30. And what I mean, let me say that again. So if you look at how many completers you had that are qualifying completers in that 2-year cohort, and you had 30 or more, then the department just stops at the 2 years. That's all they're going to do. They'll take the list of students, qualifying completers from that 2-year cohort period, and that becomes your completer list, right? And they're going to use that for doing the debt to earnings information and pulling the debt and cost information and the earnings information for the calculations. But what if you don't have at least 30 in that 2 years? Then the department's going to expand back to and create a 4-year cohort and use that instead, because what they're trying to do is make sure they've got at least 30 students in the cohort that they're using, and that's for privacy concerns, right? If the department extends back and gets to 4 years, and then they still can't get at least 30 students, then for that year, they will not calculate rates for you, right? And I talked about last week what that means in terms of being a no result and how that sort of factors into failing and Title IV eligibility and all those kinds of things. And we go through that in the other presentation. But the critical idea here is they're really just 2 options. You've got a 2-year cohort and a 4-year cohort. They don't keep extending trying to get 30. If they can't get at least 30 in the 4-year cohort, then they just stop and they don't do the calculation. The 2-year cohort is the 3rd and 4th award years prior to the year for which the most recent earnings data are available from the federal agency with earnings data at the time the DE rates and earnings premium measure are calculated. I know that's a mouthful. Again, I'm going to show you a graphic in a second. It's going to make this a lot easier. The 4-year cohort period, but this is the regulatory language. The 4-year cohort period, in turn, is defined as the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th award years prior to the award year for which the most recent earnings data are available. So in the commentary, and so there's always a real question when in every version of this rule, when it comes out, the department always likes to define the cohort period in this way. And then there's the question, of course, of, well, what's the most recent year for which earnings data is going to be available, so we can figure out, where to start counting and how to determine the award years that we're dealing with. And I just want to be real clear. This is discussed in the proposed rule, and it was confirmed in the final rule. Now, it could move between now and when this thing actually rolls out. A lot of human resource constraints. We've got a presidential election, litigation. So, if it takes 2 or 3 years for this thing to really theoretically get rolling, it could be that all of this shifts because the most recent year for which earnings data is available is a more recent year, right? But in the proposed and final rule, this is what the department anticipates. So it says, given the current data production schedules, the initial DE rates and earnings premium would be calculated, they expect, in late 2024 or early 2025. All your reporting obligations, which we discussed in last week's webinar, most of the data you have to report would be reported no later than October 1st, 2024. Right? Whether you do standard reporting or this transitional reporting that we'll talk about in a bit, regardless, by October 1st, we expect that everything will be in. So then the department's going to get to calculating, right, and running numbers. It is hard for me to believe that they would be able to accomplish everything by December 31st, 2024. So our expectation is the first half of 2025. And we think they're going to really want to hit that for a number of reasons, but among others, so they don't end up with 2 cycles running on top of each other, right? I mean, we really think they're going to want to try to complete the first cycle so that when they start the second cycle in fall of 2025, they're not still working through the first cycle, right? For most programs, what that means is the 2-year cohort period would be comprised of qualified completers, right, who completed in award years 2017, 2018, and 2018 and 2019, using their earnings data measured in calendar years 2021 and 2022 as applicable. So this is important. So if you're getting ready to model these numbers and you're going to pursue a standard reporting schedule, right, then these are the years for which you will be most concerned and that you'll want to use for your projections, right? At least that first cycle of projections. The department confirms in the final rule these projections in terms of years, and it says the first official rates published under these regulations will, for most programs, be based on students who completed a program in award years 18-19, so that's 17-18, 18-19, and again, measuring earnings outcomes in 2021 and 2022. I'm going to show you a nifty chart in a minute, a couple of charts actually that start to help. Hopefully, for me, the graphics are helpful. I also have a couple of exceptions for you, right? So, first of all, qualifying graduate programs. And there's been a concept, this is a new concept in this rule, but philosophically, the department has had a way of trying to deal with graduate programs that have clinical experiences in every version of this rule. So this is sort of the current way that they're dealing with this. So the final rule includes this new definition of a qualifying graduate program, which has one meeting in the first 3 award years and then another afterward because they got to do some research and they want to sort of finalize the list of what they think this is. So it's a little looser in the first 3 years, and then they're supposed to start publishing a real, sort of definitive list in the Federal Register. But foundationally, this is the idea. These are programs where students must complete required post-graduation training programs to obtain licensure in fields like medicine, osteopathy, dentistry, and clinical psychology, and most importantly, where they have some sort of clinical or internship experience that delays them really beginning to earn at a representative level. And that's the primary issue, right? They know that students who come out of these types of programs, even 2 or 3 years out, which is when for every other program they'll be sampling earnings, even 2 or 3 years out, these students may still be in some sort of internship capacity, right, in which their earnings are significantly depreciated. And they also know that right after they get out of that capacity, their earnings may experience a very meaningful jump. So what they're trying to do is to extend the space between when graduates in these programs graduate and when the department samples their earnings. So instead of it being 2.5 to 3 years, which is what it will be for every other program, here it's going to be 4 or 5 years. It gets a little further out. So what that means is in the first year when the department is calculating rates, since it can't push earnings forward, what it has to do is it has to go further back in time for these programs for the cost and debt data. So for qualifying graduate programs only, the 2-year cohort period will be award years 14-15 and 15-16, and the 4-year cohort period would be award years 12-13 through 15-16. I know that sounds fairly incredible. I mean, what that means is if you've got one of these programs, the department's asking you, if you do the standard reporting, to report data that's a decade old relative to when this rule becomes effective. And we talked about this last week. The department anticipates some people won't have this data available, and then there's a process for letting the department know if that's the case for you. But this is the first exception. Every program that's not a qualifying graduate program, it's the 2-year and 4-year cohorts we talked about on the prior slide. And then for qualifying graduate programs, it's a slightly adjusted 2-year and 4-year cohort. And here we have a magical graphic that hopefully will make this much easier. So you can see right here on the graphic, right, you've got the 2-year cohort standard, 17, 18, 18, 19. And then you've got the 4-year cohort standard, so that's everything but a qualifying graduate program. And you see that's 15, 16 through 18, 19. And then the 2-year cohort for qualifying graduate programs, 14, 15, 15, 16. And then the 4-year cohort, for qualifying graduate programs, 12, 13 through 15, 16. So if you're projecting rates and you want to see what your rates are likely going to look like under a standard reporting or standard calculation model, right? And I keep saying standard because there's a transitional concept I'm going to get to next. But for the standard projections, this is the years from which you want to take completers, right? So we talked about like finding our institution, finding our programs, figuring out who our qualifying completers are. Did they get some Title IV? Is it a Title IV eligible program? They didn't have any of the other exclusions and they completed, right? But then there's this question of what are the award years? So if you're doing just a regular bachelor's degree program, for example, for a normal program, but for a not qualifying graduate program, right? So just a standard program, then you're going to be looking at qualifying completers who completed the program in award years 17, 18, and 18, 19. And just to be really clear, it's not about when they enrolled. It's not about the duration enrolled. It's about the years in which they completed. So you're going to have a list, if you want to think of it that way, of individuals who are qualifying completers and who completed the program during these award years, right? And that's how you're going to finalize your cohort. Now, I keep talking about this transitional concept. So for a lot of different reasons, among others, people saying, well, wait a minute, if all of the year's prior data when this rule becomes effective, we'll have no way to impact our debt or cost information, right? I mean, if you recall the prior slide, you're talking about information that in some cases is a decade old. So the first cycle, when you calculate these rates, and actually for several cycles out into the future, you're going to be using cost and debt data that's totally baked. Well, that doesn't sound right. There's nothing we can do to affect that. And to some extent, by the way, that is the case. But the department also was concerned about the reporting burden, asking folks to report, 7, 8 award years of data by July 31 of next year, with an additional year by October 1st of next year. So there's this huge reporting obligation for all your programs and all your students, right? And we talk a lot about the reporting requirements on last week's webinar, so you can go back and check all that out. But, the department said, okay, we understand. We hear all this pushback. And I think they also understood that if they move forward with the original proposal, that would be additional fodder for litigation. So they came up with this transitional concept. And they said, okay, how about this? So for the first 6 years that this thing is in place, and we run through the first 6 cycles, because that's how long it'll take to catch up to July 1, 2024. So 6 years out is the first time that all of the data the department would be using, right, with a couple of exceptions, but for almost all programs, would be after the date this rule became effective. So the department said, okay, for the first 6 years that this thing's in place and we run rates, institutions can choose to only report data for the 2 most recent completed award years, which in this case, and you can see this graphic, if July 1, 2024 is the date this thing becomes effective, those would be the years 22, 23, and 23, 24. So if you're just thinking in terms of reporting burden, this is a pretty easy riddle to solve, right? I think a lot of schools will say, and we talked last week about some of the trade-offs here, but I think a lot of schools will say, well, gosh, we're just going to report these 2 years worth of data. But that also means then that adjusts how the department's going to do the calculations. So if you're trying to project performance and really get a sense as to how your numbers are going to turn out, it's critically important that you understand this, right? And what we strongly recommend, and I think I have it on the next slide or two, is that folks do it both ways. Without regard to how you plan to produce this data, and again, our expectation is a lot of institutions will want to go the transitional rate approach. Before you make a decision, and we don't know when that's going to be, that you're going to have to notify the department of your election, but our advice would be run the numbers both ways, right? Because once you put the infrastructure in and you start pulling all this data and figure all this out, and it's not that much harder, we think, probably to pull prior year data, for 5 back years instead of just 2 back years. So our strong advice is run it both ways and then, get a strong sense as to whether or not the transitional performance would be better or the standard calculations look better. And if you're going to do transitional, keep in mind you have some impact to alter the cost and debt data, because the second cycle, when the department runs the numbers that it's going to produce, say, in spring of 2026, that will include the debt and cost information for students who graduated in 24-25, which hasn't started yet. So you have no ability, if you choose standard reporting, to impact the cost and debt data. All of it's cooked for 6 years, right? But if you choose transitional reporting, you have some ability to start making decisions now if you do these projections and get a sense of how your programs are performing, and potentially to lower cost or try to impact debt borrowing behavior on the part of borrowers, and at any rate to make some strategic and tactical decisions, right? But we recommend understand both and project both. The department's not going to do that. Under the 2014 model, they did. They ran normal and then transitional rates for everybody and gave you the benefit. Here, it suggests that the department, you've got to choose. Are you going to do transitional reporting or standard? And that seems necessary, because if you choose transitional, you're only reporting 2 years of data. So the department couldn't run the standard numbers, right? But again, I know I'm beating this drum. We think it's really important that you understand how both of these will work. Pull data for both cohort periods and run the numbers both ways, right? So if an institution elects the transitional reporting, the department will calculate transitional DE rates and an earnings premium measure, and this is the quote from the regs, using the median debt for the period reported. So that would be that 2 years that you saw on the prior slide. So for the first time they're doing it, it would be for 22, 23, and 23, 24. This is the part I wanted to focus on. And again, this is right out of the regulation. And then it says, and the earnings for 6 years. I do not know what that means. One of the unfortunate side effects of the department running through this entire rulemaking very rapidly, which is another conversation. But, particularly with fear of the government shutdown, the speed with which this large and complex rule was pushed through, the public comment period was only 30 days. Then they had to evaluate thousands and thousands of comments. And then they put this rule out almost a month ahead of when typically I think we would have expected them to. The result seems to be some vagaries and other confusing concepts that popped up in the Federal Register. We anticipate that they'll just have to work through all this. But again, so what it says is when they calculate the transitional rates, instead of using the traditional cohort, remember we showed you that on prior slides, the traditional cohort, they're going to be using cost and data information for qualified completers who completed your program in the 2 most recent award years. But then the question is, well, where's the earnings data come from? It can't come from those same individuals because they haven't even graduated yet, and there hasn't 3 years haven't elapsed before they may have graduated, but there hasn't been a 3-year period for them to get to the earnings point yet. So what we would anticipate is that the earnings data has got to be coming from students who graduated potentially during the standard cohort. And by the way, in 2014, that's how it worked. The department did these transitional rates, and they took the debt and cost data from one cohort of students who had graduated more recently, and then they took the earnings data from students who had graduated in the traditional cohorts. But here they say for 6 years, and that's a little confusing. And here we've got a graphic that sort of illustrates some of this. So if you look in the first column, and this is if you're going to run these numbers, this should be a really helpful chart. So we've got the periods for first year calculations using the standard model, right? So in 2024, 2025, if you look, you can go down on the left side, and this is for everything but qualifying graduate programs. As you know, again, they have slightly different cohort periods. But for all the other programs that are out there, if you look, the standard 2-year cohort, remember, is 17, 18, 18, 19. And for students who completed in 17, 18, the earnings data comes from 2021. For students who completed in 18, 19, the earnings data comes from 2022. And then you can see the standard 4-year. If they have to expand 4 years, you've got 4 award years of completers, and now you've got 4 earnings years in each case associated with the appropriate year. So then you go over, let's say you take my advice, we're going to run the numbers both ways. Now we want to do the transitional cohort as well. So now we're looking at folks who qualifying completers, completed our program in 22, 23, and 23, 24, right? But what about the earnings years? Even if you used every earnings year that's associated with either the 4-year cohort or the 2-year cohort for standard graduates, it's still only 4 years, right? 19, 20, 21, and 22. But that regulatory language says 6 earnings years. The only thing I can think right now is they're trying to also take into account qualifying graduate programs. And they're saying, well, so we're going to look at earnings data across the 4 years for most folks, but we may have to go back 2 additional years if it's a qualifying graduate program. Again, it's a little confusing. I don't think here it matters. And this is why I say that. Because what you want to make sure you're doing is getting the numerator right when you run these two, but your earnings data isn't going to be this specific anyway, and we're going to get to earnings later, right? But you don't actually have the ability to go to the earnings agency and pull the actual earnings data for your students across any time period. So what you're going to have to do is just try to ballpark what you think the earnings would have been across the appropriate years. But it would be helpful to know, right? It would be helpful to know if the department's going to be sampling earnings from completers of your program, from 2017 to 2022, including 2 to 3 years of pandemic, right? Or if it's just going to be taking earnings from 2020, 22, it's just not clear in the regulatory text. So hopefully the department will give us some additional guidance. Again, I think you can go ahead and go through this exercise and sort of all the earnings, and we'll talk about this later, all the earnings work that you're going to be doing is going to be about gathering data points and sort of guesstimating to the best of your ability what you think that earnings number likely would be, because you can't pull the actual data anyway. So, but hopefully we will get some additional clarity from the department, because that may help you at least develop a number that's a little closer to what we think the department might be using for you. Okay, finalizing your cohort, last piece. For purposes of this projection exercise, again, we suggest projecting rates under both the standard cohort model and the traditional cohort model, and you can probably use the same earnings information in your denominator, pending getting some additional feedback from the department of what it means by 6 years of earnings. If after applying all the exclusions, 30 or more students did not complete, we talked about this too, then the department would not go ahead and calculate rates. But for purposes of this exercise, this is the second bullet, we again suggest that you go ahead and run the numbers, right? Because even if the department's not going to calculate an actual number for you because we think you only had 29 students, you ought to go ahead and run the numbers and see how your program's likely going to perform. That's better than not running the numbers at all, right? Okay, here's your second secret word of the day. Remember, the first secret word was it's, but the second secret word is raining. Raining, as in raining outside. So find that child box to your left or to your right. Find the radio button next to the word raining and go ahead and check it so you can get your continuing legal education credit. If you're a non-attorney, it's a great time to take a sip of water or hit pause or do whatever you might like to do. If it's November 14th, you probably can't hit pause. But if it's after the fact on YouTube, you can hit pause and go get a drink of water. Okay. At any rate, please, if you're an attorney, click next to the radio button associated with the word raining, and we're going to keep on moving. Okay. Step 5, believe it or not, I really think the rest gets a little bit easier here. It becomes more just a matter of numbers. If you can get your completer list right, then the rest of it is really just about running numbers and doing the math. But those first few steps, there's a lot of room for error. And so hopefully if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us or just go back to the materials, etc. But want to make sure you do that correctly. Okay, so calculating debt. So now we've figured out our completers list. Here's the inside baseball. The amount used for each student's loan debt, and by the way, these calculations are based on debt and actual debt and cost data for each completer, right? There's not sort of summary data that's being used. But here's the inside baseball is that the number the department's going to use for each student is actually the lesser of the student's actual loan debt or net direct costs. And the notion here, and this breaks in favor of institutions, is that, look, if you've got a program where 90% of your students are borrowing more than the cost, everything you're assessing, the cost and everything, and they can do that, right, in some programs because of housing and other types of allowances, the department is acknowledging that you shouldn't be penalized for that, right? So again, if you've got a program, sticker price is $30,000, and you gave the student a $10,000 grant, but they were able to get enough aid that it exceeds that number that you assessed and actually charge them, and the department is saying, okay, we're going to give you the benefit of the lower number. This also is critically important to understand if you're developing a strategy for trying to improve your debt to earnings rates for a particular program. Because, and I'll keep this quick, but just sort of thought experiment here. If you've got a program where 95% of the students are borrowing about half as much as the cost of the program. So again, let's say our program's $30,000, and let's just say everybody it gets charged exactly the same amount, and everybody is borrowing $10,000 to get through this program, right? Then that means for each student, the department is going to be using the $10,000 number because that's the debt number and that's the lesser of the two. If you say we need to improve our debt to earnings rate, and so we're just going to slash the cost of our program by $5,000 so that it's now $25,000, if all those students are still borrowing 10, you have not improved your debt to earnings rate, right? This is a really important concept. And I knew folks in 2010 and 2014 who did not understand this and lowered the price of programs, but not enough to change the borrowing behavior of their borrowers. And the consequence was it had no impact on their debt to earnings rate, right? So you really have to understand, is it the debt number that's predominantly being used or the cost number? And our experience is when you look at the data, typically for a program, you'll see a profile emerge. In most programs, most students are either borrowing more than the cost or less than the cost, right? Because it has to do with the aid available and the type of student and the type of program. But that informs your strategy for improving your debt to earnings rates. And it's a really important concept to understand. Okay, so for each student, you have to select which number to include when you project the median loan debt for the whole cohort, when you're calculating that median. And the lesser number may vary from student to student. So keep in mind, within a given cohort, some students may have a higher cost number and some students may have a higher debt number, though per my prior comment, we typically see that most students break in one direction or another. Okay, so what goes into the loan debt number? When you're pulling data for your programs, this is when you go to your IT guy. These are the data points you're trying to get, right? Or whoever is managing your data systems. So for any Title IV loans the student borrowed, right? So that's the first thing that goes into the debt number. Any Title IV loans the student borrowed. Total amount dispersed, less any cancellations or adjustments, except for those related to false certification, bar defense discharge. You probably won't know those things. So just, Title IV, adjusted Title IV. For enrollment in the program, excluding direct plus loans, and there was some back and forth on this during the negotiated rulemaking, so I'm glad to say they excluded direct plus loans made to parents of dependent students and direct unsubsidized loans converted from teacher grants. Okay. Any private education loans, including made by the institution that the student borrowed for enrollment in the program and are required to be reported to the department, right? And you can look in the 66843, and we talked about this in last week's presentation to determine exactly what has to be reported. But the critical idea here is it's not just Title IV loans. You also have to include in this debt number private education loans. And finally, this is the third big component, the amount outstanding as of the date the student completes the program on any other credit extended by or on behalf of the institution for enrollment. So if you got a payment plan, right, that sets up payments for a student and extends beyond the graduation date, right? And this could be on a retail installment contract. It could just be regular, any kind of extension of credit basically that you've made to the student, then you're going to also have to take that into account. And it's however much is left at the time they graduate. So fundamentally, and look at the details, but fundamentally, there are three programs that go into this. Three components to this debt number. Any Title IV loans, any private education loans of which you're aware, and finally, the amount outstanding and owed to the institution at the time the student completed the program. I don't know if you guys can hear, in my little hometown here at 11 o'clock on Mondays, they test the tornado siren. So there's not a tornado emergency if you can hear that siren right now. It's just a test. It'll stop momentarily. For each student, so now we're talking about the cost number, remember? So we need a debt number for each student and we need a cost number for each student. So we talked about what goes into the debt calculation. This is the cost calculation. So for each student, it's the total amount of tuition and fees that you assess the student for the program, right? The total amount of and that's for the whole program, by the way, just to be real clear. This isn't an award year by award year calculation, right? We're talking about students who graduated in a particular award year, but we want to know all the tuition and fees that you assess that individual for the program that they just completed. The total amount of the allowances for books, supplies, and equipment included in the student's Title IV cost attendance, or a higher amount if there was a specific amount that was higher actually assessed the student for those things. By the way, for purposes of these exercises, unless you think you are routinely assessing students for book, supplies, and equipment, a number that is higher than the allowance and their cost of attendance, we would just use the cost of attendance number, right? I mean, there might be a little bit of error there, but in our experience, it can be hard to figure that out. That's a lot of burden for running these projections, and it's probably easier to just say, well, what's the built-in budget? Unless for some reason we think we are just for students routinely charging a significant amount more. Finally, and this was a huge innovation in this version of the rule that didn't exist in the prior innovations, you get to net out any institutional grant or scholarship funds. So total amounts assessed plus that budget for books, supplies, and equipment, less institutional grants or scholarships. And that's a big innovation, and you want to make sure you're taking advantage of that, right? And they need to be genuine institutional grants or scholarships, by the way. But if they are, you can net it out of the number. By genuine, I just mean it can't be something that looks like a loan or something along those lines. I mean, I think what is contemplated here is an actual grant or scholarship to the student, a deduction off of the tuition and fees that they otherwise would pay. Okay, we talked about rolling up debt previously a little bit, but just remember when you're running all of these numbers to make that adjustment. If you routinely have students who are completing your associate degree program, then matriculating to a bachelor's degree program, or completing a cert program and getting into an associate's degree, you want to make sure that you're putting folks in the right cohorts and rolling up the debt, right? Won't make a big difference if you just have onesies and twosies, but if the programs are designed that way and a significant percentage of your students move out of those lower programs into the higher programs, you want to make this adjustment. The only other thing also I'll remind you is it never crosses the line from undergraduate to graduate, right? So it's only in the graduate side and then and it's only in the undergraduate side and then in the graduate side. Okay. Also, for purposes of calculating DE rates, the department will only include students who receive Title IV funds. I know I've hit on this a couple of times, but it sometimes can throw people when they're actually running these numbers. And they see that, they've got their debt number and their cost number, and they say, well, wait a minute, my debt number is 0. Why is that? It's because they got a grant. So they're still a qualifying completer because they received some form of Title IV aid, but they may not have had any loans. They may not have taken out any Title IV loans at all, or even private education loans, or owed you anything at the time they graduated. That's okay. Not only is it okay, is great, because if you have a bunch of students with debt numbers that are 0, first of all, they're still in the cohort and they'll still impact where the median falls, right? Because they're going to show up in our, when we do the whole thing and find the median for the entire group. So that's okay. Just don't be thrown by it. All right. So getting that median program debt, this is really not hard. I don't mean to be too rudimentary here, but sometimes median throws people. Just to be clear, we're not talking about an average. This isn't a mean. It's a median. So to determine the median of the numbers, you place all these numbers in a row, right? And you're finding the one that's in the middle. In instances where the cohort includes an even number of students, you would identify the middle pair of numbers and calculate the value that's halfway between them. That's how you get the median. And if you're using Excel, which we do for all of this, or some sort of spreadsheet that's comparable, you can just use functions. And actually, we're going to give you formulas in the next couple of stages, because you certainly don't want to be doing this longhand. By the way, this is just a helpful visual. Sometimes when we project rates for schools, and we do a lot of that, we have sort of a spreadsheet we send out that we need them to populate. Now, it's got the underlying data points for debt and cost, which we sort of aggregate up, but ultimately we end up with something that looks kind of like this. So, and I think it's helpful to visualize. So in the first column, you just see we've got student numbers here, but you can imagine that could be all your student names. And then for each student, we've got the actual debt number, and then we've got their net direct cost number. And then on the far right, we've got the lesser of those two columns. And so you can see for student 12, the debt number is lesser, right? But actually, if you go to student 13, who's right in the middle, right, you'll see it's the net direct cost number that's less. And that's what makes it over into the far right column. And then you sort the column, right, on the far right, from highest to lowest, or however you want to do it. And then you find the number in the middle, and you can use that median function. So for this cohort, right, theoretically, student 13, and let's just imagine we've got 30 or more, so that we would actually be running with these numbers and the department would be calculating something. The median for this cohort is 25,000. Okay, so now that we've got the median, how do we get to the annual loan payment? What's the last step so that we can finalize our numerator? By the way, getting the numerator and the debt to earnings is by far the most labor-intensive process. The earnings piece of this and the earnings premium is going to be a lot less. So don't worry, we're not like 10% of the way through the presentation. Well over half. Okay, so this is the last step. This is all just math. So to convert that median debt number into an annual loan payment that you can use in your numerator, right, you need basically two things. The first thing is you need to know the repayment period to amortize this, and that's set out in the regulations, and it varies based on the length of the credential. It's either 10, 15, or 20 years. And you can see here it's 10 years if it's an undergraduate cert, post-baccalaureate certificate, associate degree, or graduate certificate, 15 years if it's a bachelor's or master's degree, 20 years if it's any other program. And there are a lot of people who've commented and said, we don't necessarily agree with this approach, but this is the approach that we've got in the regs. So you have to make sure you're adjusting your amortization when you're running the numbers based on the length of the program or the type of the program. The other piece you need is the annual interest rate. So the department will use to amortize the median loan debt an interest rate that it calculates pursuant to a particular formula. And I've laid it all out here for you. And again, it varies based on the program. It's a little cumbersome to read through, but the notion is, depending on which bucket you fall in, you're going to look at some of the historic interest rates that apply to the appropriate type of direct unsubsidized loan. So for undergraduate programs, we're looking at undergraduate, graduate, we're looking at graduate, direct loans. So we'll just use the bachelor's degree as an example here, though. It's the third one down, right? Bachelor's degree programs. So what you're taking is the average of the federal direct unsubsidized loan interest rates in prior years, applicable to undergraduate students that were in effect during the 6 consecutive award years, ending in the final year of the cohort period. Okay, Aaron, that sounds complicated. What do we mean by that? Well, first of all, by the way, here's all your historic interest rates. And we pulled this off the U.S. Department of Education's website. And if you like, the link is down at the bottom, so you can go out and verify these numbers. I'm happy for you to do that. But I think all the data is here that you would actually need to calculate these averages. And then I give you an example. So, and I use the bachelor's degree example here. So if you assume you're projecting the DE rates for the 24-25 award year, which will be our first cycle, for a bachelor's degree program using the standard 2-year cohort, so this assumes we have 30 or more qualifying completers in that 2-year period. And so we're talking about folks who completed in 17-18 and 18-19. The applicable annual interest rate would be the average of the interest rates used for undergraduate federal direct unsubsidized loans for award years 13-14 through 18-19. So that's the 6 years ending, right, at 18-19, which is the most recent year that's part of our cohort period, right? So if you calculate that number, the average interest rate used for undergraduate federal direct unsubsidized loans for award years 13, 14 through 18, 19 is 4.35. So that's when you're running your numbers, that's the formula you would use. So once you've determined the applicable repayment period and interest rate, now you have all the data points you need to calculate the annual loan payment. And just as a side note, what we're actually going to do is we're going to calculate the monthly loan payment because that's how all the mathematical formulas generally work. And then you just multiply it by 12. Boy, Aaron, this sounds like a lot of math. Rest assured, it's not that complicated. So first of all, here's the actual formula. If your math department wants to volunteer to do all of this on a legal pad, they certainly can. But if you're like me and you went to law school and you don't want to try to do math that way, then this is the Excel formula, right? So you can take this formula and here's the values. The D, I, and Y is not do it yourself. Although you are doing it yourself here, I suppose. I should have been more clever and organized it in that order. Median loan debt for the program is D. The annual interest rate is I. Y is the number of years in the repayment period. And we just talked about how you would achieve those. When you get your data into your spreadsheets, you can plug this formula in, and it will generate for you that annual loan payment. And here's what it actually looks like if you put in numbers. So if you're using our example, the annual loan payment for the undergraduate bachelor's program for 24-25, median loan debt of $25,000, remember, and a repayment period of 15 years, which is what we have for bachelor's programs, and an interest rate of 4.35%, then this is where the math actually plays out using that formula. And you can see at the very bottom, it yields an annual loan payment of $2,272. And that's the numerator. You can see we included the calculations again down there for both of our equations. You know, I talked earlier about, and this is what we're going to get into next, that there's only so much you can do with the earnings data. But we think you can do a pretty good job with the numerator here. And that's important because while we have to guess a little at the earnings data, and we're going to talk about how you can do that in a minute, you know what the passing thresholds are, and we think you can get really close on your numerator. And one approach folks have used, and we're actually using more recently with a lot of our clients, instead of trying to project rates, which is kind of what this exercise is about, but we take a slightly different approach. What we do is we calculate that numerator, and then we talk about what the thresholds are, and then we just say, here's the earnings for. So in other words, you have to have confidence as an institution that your cohort, you know, for which we're taking earnings, including folks who aren't working or, you know, for whatever reason, or may not be working in field, et cetera. So you may have some zeros, they could be underreporting income, you know, taking all that sort of into account. Do you believe that you guys would exceed this earnings threshold? And sometimes we think that's a better way for schools to approach it than to try to guess at an earnings number and then just come up with a number and say, well, we're passing or not passing. So just a variation on how all of this can work for you. All right. So we've got the numerator for our DE rates. What about the denominators? To determine annual earnings for each program, I mentioned earlier, the department is going to take earnings from an earnings agency, probably the IRS, though it hasn't been announced yet. The most currently available, this is what they're going to get from them. The most currently available median annual earnings of the students who completed the program during the cohort period who are not excluded. So to be clear, what the department has always represented in 2014 and now as well is that they're not going to get back a list from the earnings agency that says, you know, Ted made this much and Jane made this much. They're going to send over the cohort, and then the earnings agency is going to pull the earnings numbers from everyone in that cohort and just send back the median, right? So the department's not supposed to get the individual earnings for the individuals in the completer or in the cohort. The department will then take the completer list and send it to the earnings agency requesting the median for the cohort. Okay, so I just said the earnings agency will retrieve the reported earnings for the calendar year that's approximately 3 years following the award year for which those students graduated. So if you recall our example in which we were projecting DE rates for the 24-25 award year for the bachelor's degree program, right? And we were using folks who graduated and completed 17-18 and 18-19. For this program, we would anticipate that the completer list would include some students who graduated in 17-18 and some in 18-19, right? So for the students who graduated in 17-18, the earnings agency would actually retrieve earnings from 2021. And for those who graduate in 18-19, the earnings agency would actually retrieve earnings information for calendar year 2022. And here's the chart again. Remember, you saw this earlier. We went through all the debt and cost side, but just again to note, it includes those earning years as well. And you can use this when you're sort of requesting data and trying to put all this together. But here's the issue, right? Because the earnings agency data is not available, what you've got to do is come up with a proxy. And our advice is, don't just use one data point, right? Try to gather 2 or 3 potential data points and then make some very conservative estimates. That's how we would suggest going about it. And that's how we tend to go about it when we do this for clients. So the first and most obvious place to pull numbers is the 2022 program performance data set that the department included with both the proposed and the final rule. And it's still sitting out there on regulations.gov. Aaron, what are you talking about? So in connection with the pros rule and the final rules, the department had to do this big regulatory impact analysis. And they actually gathered a ton of data and tried to calculate some rates, right? So what I'm telling you is right now, if you go out to regulations.gov, you can pull this spreadsheet, this massive data set, and it actually has debt to earnings rates that have been calculated for your programs, including for some of your programs potentially, including the actual debt numbers and the earnings data that the department previously pulled. Now, the debt and cost figures were calculated using NSLDS data for students who completed in 15, 16, and 16, 17. I mean, we think you can do better than that, right? You can pull actual data out of your systems for folks in the appropriate cohorts that the department's going to be using, both on the standard model and the transitional model. So, our expectation, I mean, you could pull this debt and cost data if you like that the department used, but or at least debt data, but our expectation is you can probably do a better job with the numerator, right? The earnings figures, though, you don't have. So here, they used earnings figures that they got from Treasury for students who completed in award years 14, 15, and 15, 16. And the earnings came from calendar years 2018 and 2019. Now, this is pre-pandemic data, and it's several years old at this point, right? But it's probably the best data set that you've got available. I mean, there was some stuff that was released back in 2010 and 12 and 14 under prior versions of this rule, but it's ancient. This stuff, 18 and 19, this is actual earnings data the department pulled from Treasury, presumably for the folks who actually graduated from your program. So we think, without question, this is one of the places that you'll want to start. You can access the 2022 PPD at the link, or you can click on this picture. So you go to regulations.gov and you put in this docket ID number, right? And that'll bring up 2 or 3 different things. And one of the things you can see is final rule. You can click on final rule, and there's a new little tab up at the top that says, view more documents. And that's how you'll get to this screen that you're seeing on the page right now. And then it's got 3 or 4 documents related to the data set. So it's got the actual data set, and then it's got some Word documents that describe the data that you're seeing. Okay, 2 other places that you can potentially pull data from. One is institutional information, right? So you may do graduate surveys. Your career services staff may have a strong sense of what folks are earning, particularly your graduates, by the way, because, if you get state level numbers or national numbers, they're not as good. What we really want is what your graduates are earning. But through a variety of means, you may have folks at your institution that have a strong sense of what graduates are typically making right now if they're working in field. But I want to highlight, you see, I put it in red here, but remember, because this is just so critically important. I've seen schools miss this many times over. The annual earnings the department is calculating for your cohort includes earnings for all of your completers. So if you've got folks who complete and you think, for example, they may be subject to wage discrimination if a significant number of your graduates are minorities or women, right? If your graduates are largely in a rural area as opposed to in an urban market, right? If there's any reason that you think your graduates, let's say a lot of them do gig work and may be underreporting their earnings, right? Or let's say some of them, you think significant percentage of your graduates just aren't pursuing work in field or are staying home or, whatever. You've got to accommodate all of that when you come up with your earnings. So it's not the median earnings of graduates who are employed in field. It's the median earnings for all the people who completed and graduated on your completer list. So when you come up with that cohort, right, you say, these are the folks who graduated from our program. Let's say you're doing the transitional rates, and you're saying, this is the folks we think graduating 22, 23, 23, 24. Maybe that wasn't a good example because you're going to be still using earnings information from the standard cohort. Okay, but let's say you're trying to come up with earnings for the last, say, 4 years between 18, 19, 20, and 21, 22. Just keep in mind what you're really thinking about is what do we think the median is for all of these folks based on any capacity they may be in and the earnings that they're reporting to the IRS, right? Just keep that in mind. Okay. The other place you can look is federal and state earnings data. Again, this is really likely going to reflect what folks are earning who are in field. So in other words, BLS or, we like ONET, the online website that you can go to that's sponsored by the U.S. Department of Labor because it gives state level data, right? But what they're saying is, people who graduate in this field right now, this is the 25% mark, the 50% mark, the 75% mark of what they're likely earning. But again, it's really contemplating folks who are employed in that profession. So we would always take the 25% number at the most aggressive to try to accommodate the fact that there are going to be folks who are down at and making nothing or less, I should say, even in that field who are working. There may be folks making less than 25%. And then there may be folks who aren't making anything because they're not employed. Again, they're staying home with a family or, pursuing other interests that don't earn income, et cetera, right? So it's tricky business. We would say pull the data from the department's data set, talk to your career services staff, look at the state level and national BLS and Bureau of Labor and Statistics data. Take all of that into account, take a conservative view, try to accommodate, those ideas of folks who may be underreporting or not working, right? And come up with a conservative number and use that for your denominator. Or conversely, you can actually, as I mentioned a few moments ago, use the threshold and the numerator and just come up with what would be the earnings floor or minimum for you to have a passing rate. And then you can just think about, do we really think that we're there or not? Okay. Projecting DE rate, step 9, discretionary earnings. So remember, we actually have two calculations, right? The numerator is the same for both. We just talked about getting median earnings. So how do we get discretionary earnings, right? That's the denominator in our second equation. It's really easy. So for each program, the discretionary earnings number is calculated. You just take the annual earnings figure that you just calculated, that median annual earnings number, and you subtract from it 150% of the poverty guideline for a single person in the continental United States as published by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. That's it. So it's just one slightly additional calculation. You can build it into your spreadsheet. The department uses the poverty guideline for the most recent calendar year in which annual earnings are obtained. So by way of example, the 2022 poverty guideline for a single person in the United States is $13,590. As you calculate these rates, if this rule sticks and we go through multiple cycles, you'll need to make an adjustment. But for the first year, that's probably the number that you can use. So to determine your discretionary earnings for a program with an annual earnings of $40,000, here's an example. You would just say 40,000 minus 13,590 times 1.5, which yields 19,615, and that would be your denominator. Okay, putting it all together. So this is just drawn from our spreadsheet, and it gives you a sense of what this can look like. So you have your median annual earnings, which we just talked about sort of second. I don't know why I have that on top in the chart, but that we just came up with $40,000, and maybe that's after lots of discussion with different people and pulling various different data points. You plug in that 2022 poverty guideline, just so you've got that number in there. So that's the denominator in the other equation. Discretionary earnings. So then you see, the 2022 poverty guideline, that's actually the amount we're subtracting from the 40,000. And the discretionary earnings row is the resulting number. So 40,000 is the denominator in the first equation. 19,615 is the denominator in the second equation. We've got our interest rate plugged in. We've got our repayment period because this is for a bachelor's degree program, which generates that annual loan payment of $2,272, and all the math is in the background in the cells for the spreadsheet, and it pushes out an annual DE rate of 5.7% and a discretionary DE rate of 11.6%. So this profile would work for a program. It's passing both rates. And keep in mind, you only have to pass one of those two to pass the DE rates construct, right? Either one can pass. All right. Third secret word of the day. Third secret word. So it's metrics. So it's raining metrics. That's how it feels. If you will look at the child box to your left or to your right, find that radio button next to the word metrics and go ahead and click it if you're an attorney looking for CLE. Again, the first secret word was its, second raining, and now our third secret word is metrics. Not as popular a song, so go ahead and click that radio button next to the word metrics, please, so you can get your continuing legal education credit. And then we're almost at the end here. Let's wrap this webinar up, right? Okay, how about the earnings premium? So first of all, the earnings premium, you can see the calculation here again. I put it down where it's available. The first number is median annual earnings. That's the same number that you just came up with for the purposes of calculating your debt to earnings rates. So you've already got one of the two numbers you need to do this, right? It's the median annual earnings number. The earnings premium for each program is simply the amount by which the program's median annual earnings exceeds the earnings threshold. That's the calculation. And in step 8 above, specifically, is where we offered suggestions for calculating median annual earnings. Okay, but how about the second number, the earnings threshold? So this is the definition that the department has in the regulations, and it's basically a number they're borrowing from the Census Bureau that they already pull. The earnings threshold, and we talked about this at length, by the way, in last week's presentation in the webinar where we sort of go over everything and talk a little more about the concerns we have around this number. But for purposes today, the important thing to understand is the earnings threshold, again, is this idea that it represents a number that is sort of what folks make on average who don't have any post-secondary education. I think the most important thing for your purposes in projecting here is just whether or not you're going to use a national number or a state number. And again, you could run it both ways. It's not that difficult. So the earnings threshold is defined. It's the Census Bureau's number. It's based on data from the Census Bureau. It's the median earnings for working adults aged 25 through 34 who either worked during the year or indicated they were unemployed but in the workforce, right? Which means when they were interviewed, like for unemployment benefits, that they were actively looking for work, and that only have a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent. And then there are two numbers. One is this group of individuals at the state level, right, in which your institution is located. And the second is this number nationally. And the department will use the national number if fewer than 50% of the students in your program. Interesting, it's not completers. It just says 50% of the students in the program are from the state where the institution is located, or if the institution is a foreign institution. So I think the only choice you really have, there are two numbers you're dealing with. You're either going to use the state level number or you're going to use the national number. And again, you might as well run the calculations both ways. It's not that difficult. Where would you get these numbers? So we can't predict what the earnings thresholds are going to be for future years because the Census Bureau hasn't released them yet. But in the proposed and final rule, the department gives us all the numbers that it used for purposes of its projections, the 22 PPD data set. So we have the earnings threshold at the national level and at all the different state levels that the department used, which is from the 2019 American Community Survey. That's the Bureau of Labor, Census Bureau's survey. So here, these are the national numbers you can see, and you see the high school or equivalent overall was 25,453, and they break it down. That's the number you want, is the overall number, right? Although you can look at some of the other numbers as they're broken out for the different degree levels, and you can see how the department did it in the 22 PPD data set. And here's the state level numbers. So you can see the earnings threshold used by the department for each state is detailed in Table 4.1, which is set forth again in the commentary to the final rule on page 7125. So I just have the graphic, but you can get the complete list if you click either on that link or on this graphic. It'll take you to the Federal Register, and then you can scroll down and find Table 4.1. So that's how we would do it. You've already come up with the median annual earnings number as part of your DE rates exercise, and then for each program, you're just going to go through using the department's methodology, and you're going to pull these earnings thresholds that it used in the 22 PPD data set, which we think is probably the best place you can get data for purposes of this, and see if you have a problem or not. Our expectation is, programs that don't cost very much, but also produce graduates that don't make a whole lot, this can be a real issue. We know based on the department's projections, and we talked about this last week in the general webinar, that cosmetology and massage therapy and some other sort of personal services industries, this potentially is a real problem. Our expectation is if you've got an MD or JD or professional graduate level program, it's probably not a problem for you. Debt to earnings rate may be an issue, but the earnings premium is likely not a problem for you. Okay, now we're basically at the end. I just want to go real quickly, a reminder that this webinar, after it airs on November 14th and the weeks and months to come, will be available on our resources page, as will last week's webinar, as will the desk guide and all our other resources that we've been creating for higher ed. We've got a lot of information around bar defense out there right now, and we also are going to be putting out, the department recently had a new rule on financial responsibility, administrative capability, certification, recertification, ability to benefit, some other stuff. We're going to be doing an updated version of our guide for financial responsibility reporting, and so look for that in the next month or so as well. And again, it'll all be at this QR code or at that website. Oh no, I got it the wrong way, at this website. Okay. I was feeling so slick. I felt like I was getting all this right with the fingers and the pointing. Okay. Our blog, Regucation, is also out there. Again, you can get links to it on the resources page or just follow it directly or sign up for it. This is last week's webinar. Or sorry, no, this is an example of our bar defense webinar that's also sitting out on our YouTube page where all the prior webinars are available and free. And then we have these white papers, and like I said, the Financial Responsibility Reporting Guide and the Desk Guide are examples of those. And finally, just a disclaimer, we're not your attorneys unless we're your attorneys. And this is provided for informational and compliance and emotional support purposes only. Thank you all for listening. We know between these two webinars, it's been a whole lot to keep up with. We really appreciate you tuning in. We think this is an important rule, and we hope this helps as folks are trying to sort of decipher it all and come into compliance. If you've got issues or concerns or questions, you are always welcome to reach out to us. And if you're tuning in on November 14th, stay tuned right now because we're going to switch over to the live Q&A. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one and be well. See you next time.